Wow. Okay. This deep dive, you've given us quite the challenge here. We're tackling your critique of modern animation, and specifically zeroing in on Cartoon Network. But here's the thing. Your critique comes to us as an audio recording in Hebrew. So let's unpack this, shall we? And see what we can uncover about the evolution of animation and storytelling in children's television.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to get such a passionate critique directly from a viewer. It's a really unique window into how audiences experience these shifts in animation over time.
Yeah, and you're so right. It comes through that this person really cares about animation at its heart. The critique argues there's been a decline in the quality of Cartoon Network shows, specifically calling out the 2016 Powerpuff Girls reboot, Teen Titans Go, Adventure Time, and Uncle Grandpa. And they find fault with both the animation style and the stories themselves.
Right, and to make it even more interesting, they contrast these with older Cartoon Network shows, like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and the original Powerpuff Girls. They seem to prefer those earlier styles and the kinds of stories they told. What's fascinating is this actually connects to a much broader discussion about the evolution of animation style. And there's a technical side to this that often gets overlooked.
Okay, let's talk about that. So technology has clearly advanced so much in animation, but how has that impacted the actual style screen?
Well, think about it for a second. We've gone from traditional 2D hand-drawn animation to what we see a lot of today. Digital animation.
Yeah.
With 2D, you have artists drawing every single frame by hand, which is amazing for nuanced movement and expression, but it's also incredibly time-consuming and expensive. Digital animation makes things much more efficient and flexible, but it can result in a very different aesthetic. And maybe that's part of what the critique perceives as lazy or lacking detail.
So it's not that animators are less skilled today. It's more that the tools and techniques have fundamentally shifted. And I imagine budget constraints play a big role here too, right?
Oh, absolutely. High-quality animation, no matter the method.
Yeah.
It's expensive. Networks are always looking to streamline production and keep costs down. So sometimes choices get made that favor efficiency over, say, the meticulous detail of hand-drawn animation.
Makes total sense. So this technical shift could be one reason the critique sees shows like the Powerpuff Girls reboot or Teen Titans Go, and so different from the older shows they loved.
It's definitely a factor. And when you combine that with the evolving demands of the industry, the need to make things marketable, you start to see how animation might drift away from the aesthetics of those early Cartoon Network shows.
Now they don't just criticize the animation style. They're really critical of the storytelling in these newer shows, too, calling some plots boring or even nonsensical. So has something changed in how children's cartoons tell stories?
This is where things get really interesting, I think, because we might be seeing a shift from what we consider traditional episodic storytelling to something more fragmented, maybe less plot-driven shows like Dexter's Lab, or the original Powerpuff Girls, stuck to clear narrative with beginnings, middles, and ends within each episode. Modern shows like Teen Titans Go, they seem to prioritize humor and randomness over that traditional structure.
So it's less about a straightforward plot and more about creating moments that are funny or visually striking, even if they don't add up to a larger story arc.
Exactly. And to someone who grew up with a different style of storytelling, this might seem stupid or nonsensical. But these newer shows might actually be tapping into a different sense of humor, maybe reflecting how fast-paced everything is now and shorter attention span. We see this a lot with how people consume media today.
That's a really interesting point. It's not that the writing is bad, it's just aiming for something different than what we might have seen in the past.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of meta-humor comes into play. Shows like Teen Titans Go, they break the fourth wall all the time, making jokes that are self-aware and even poke fun at storytelling itself. It's a kind of humor that might work for adults or older kids who are in on the joke, but it might leave younger viewers or those used to straightforward stories feeling lost or bored.
So we've got these different factors interacting here. Evolving technology, budget limitations, changing comedy styles, and the shift toward meta humor. It's not so simple as saying animation was better in the past. It's more like the whole landscape has shifted, and that leads to different looks and approaches to storytelling.
You got it. And I think it's key to remember these changes don't just happen in isolation. They're shaped by broader cultural shifts, changing audience expectations. And yes, the business side of the entertainment industry plays a role too.
Yeah, right.
Okay, before we get too deep into all that, I want to circle back to something you mentioned. The critiques comparison of American cartoons to Japanese anime. And, I've always been drawn to anime myself, the visuals and the storytelling. Is there something fundamentally different in how anime approaches animation and narrative compared to, say, Cartoon Network?
That's a great observation, and it points to another layer here. Cultural differences. Anime has its own distinct artistic traditions, its own ways of telling story, often drawing on Japanese mythology, folklore, and social issues. The animation style itself, often has those large, expressive eyes, vivid colors, and dynamic action sequences.
Yes, exactly. And the stories often deal with more mature themes. They develop characters in complex ways, and they even explore philosophical ideas. You don't always find that in Western animation aimed at kids.
Exactly. So when they say they prefer anime, it might not just be personal taste. It could be that they see a depth or complexity in those narratives, or they find the visual style more appealing than what they see in current Cartoon Network shows. That's really insightful. So we're not just talking about how animation has changed technically, but also culturally, with different traditions and storytelling conventions around the world influencing how animation is made and received. Now, I know we're focusing on animation here, but the critique mentions the decline of other networks too, like Nickelodeon and Disney. Do you think this dissatisfaction with modern animation is limited to Cartoon Network, or is there something bigger happening across the board?
I think that's what makes this so interesting, because even though they focus on Cartoon Network, the fact that they bring up Nickelodeon and Disney too suggests a wider dissatisfaction with the direction of children's animation in general. It makes you wonder if there are industry-wide trends driving these changes in animation and storytelling across multiple networks.
That's a good point. It seems like we need to look beyond just Cartoon Network to really grasp what this critique is getting at.
Absolutely. To
Yeah.
do that, I think we need to dig into the history of animation, explore those cultural influences, and yes, even look at how the business side of things is shaping children's entertainment.
Okay, before we go there, I do want to acknowledge how vivid their language is when they talk about their disappointment. They describe the animation in some shows as chewing gum with no taste. They call some of the newer shows ugly and garbage, and they even say these shows are harming children.
There's no doubt. This critique comes from a place of passion. And even though the language might seem harsh, it underscores how deeply people connect with animation, especially the shows they watched as kids.
Totally. These aren't just cartoons for a lot of people. They're tied to powerful memory. And when someone feels like that sense of wonder or enjoyment is missing, it can trigger a strong reaction.
Exactly. It shows how animation, even though it's often categorized as just kid stuff, it can have a deep impact on us. It shapes our sense of humor, our taste, and even how we understand the world.
That's the perfect lead-in to the next part of our deep dive. I think it's time to zoom in on those specific examples cited in the critique. You provided some audio and video clips of those shows. Let's really unpack what's happening in them, visually and in terms of how the stories are told, and maybe we can understand why they provoke such a strong reaction.
I think that's a great idea. Let's take a look at those clips and see if we can dissect the nuances of what's going on in modern animation. Okay, so let's jump into those clips you put together and see if we can really grasp the critique's point of view.
Yeah, I'm curious what moments really stood out to them. You know, it's one thing to talk about animation styles in general, but it's another to actually see them in action.
Absolutely, context is everything. We talked about the technical shifts in animation that move toward more meta humor, and even how different cultures influence things. Now let's look at some actual examples.
Perfect. You have those queued up. Where should we start?
Well, they seem to have the biggest issues with Teen Titans Go and that 2016 Powerpuff Girls reboot, so maybe they're...
Sounds good. I've seen some episodes of both, but I'm really interested to hear your
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so that was from the Powerpuff Girls. I can see how the animation style would be jarring for someone used to the original. It's definitely simpler, less detail in the characters and background.
Yeah, you really notice those thick outlines and the almost neon color. It's very graphic, almost like vector art or certain illustration styles. It's a huge change from those rounder, more organic lines in the original Powerpuff Girls.
And the humor in that clip feels much broader, almost like it's aimed at a much younger audience than the original show was.
You're right on there. The physical comedy, the over-the-top reactions, and the simple dialogue that repeats a lot. It could be that they're trying to appeal to preschoolers, which would make sense if Cartoon Network's target audience has shifted younger over time.
So maybe it's not that the animation or the writing is bad per se, but that it's going for a different audience with different sensibilities?
Exactly. And this is where the critique gets really interesting. If they're expecting something that looks and feels like the original Powerpuff Girls, which did appeal to a slightly older audience, then this reboot is bound to disappoint.
It's like judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Right.
You're using the wrong measuring stick.
Love that analogy. Okay, before we make any judgments about the Powerpuff Girls reboot, let's see what we get from the Teen Titans Go clip. This one really got to them, so let's see why.
All right, let's hear it. Whoa, okay, that was a lot to process. It's so different from the original Teen Titans, which was more action-packed and had a much darker tone.
It's like textbook meta humor,
Yeah.
like we were talking about before. The jokes never stop, things don't make sense, they're winking at the audience. It's become so common in animation these days.
And it's funny because as an adult, I get some of the jokes. They're playing with tropes, turning things upside down. But I can also see how it wouldn't land for everyone, especially younger kids who might not get the references or know the conventions they're messing with.
Exactly. It's a real challenge to make something that works for everyone.
Yeah.
especially when the humor depends on a certain level of knowledge about pop culture or understanding how stories usually work.
And what about the animation in that clip? It felt very fluid and energetic, but also pretty different from the original Teen Titans, which had a more class.
Oh yeah, good point. So Teen Titans Go still uses 2D animation.
Okay.
But it's much more exaggerated, and cartoony characters stretch and bend in ways that are totally unrealistic. It's called squash and stretch. It's all about comedic timing and making a visual impact, not anatomical correctness.
I see. And it reminds me of those old Looney Tunes cartoons where the characters were always bending and morphing into crazy shapes.
You nailed it. That's definitely an influence on Teen Titans Go.
Sure.
It's a style that values humor and visual gags over realism or super detailed character designs.
Okay, so we've looked at two shows that got hit hard in the critique, but they also go after Adventure Time. And I actually find that show quite charming and imaginative. What's their problem with that one?
It's interesting because they don't completely trash Adventure Time. It's more like they prefer the earlier seasons, like the show lost something along the way.
Oh, I can see that. It definitely evolved over time. It became more serialized, tackled more complex themes, and even got a bit darker as it went on.
Right. And maybe that's what they're reacting to.
Yeah.
The early Adventure Time was all about whimsical, episodic adventures, nonsensical humor, and had that really vibrant, almost childlike look.
Whereas the later seasons really dug into Finn and Jake's backstories. They explored loss and trauma. They even added layers of mythology and world building.
Exactly. And maybe that change in tone and the fact that the story got more complex is what they don't. It happens all the time with TV shows. They change, characters grow, and sometimes that alienates viewers who were drawn to the original idea or style of the show.
So it's not that Adventure Time became bad. It just became something different. And that new thing didn't resonate with them.
That's a good way to put it. It shows how important it is to remember that art is subjective. What one person finds engaging or meaningful might turn someone else off or even confuse them.
Before we move on to the last show they talked about, I want to touch on something they said about older Cartoon Network shows, like Dexter's Lab and the original Powerpuff Girls. Is there something about those shows besides nostalgia that made them so good?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What makes animation truly great? Shows like Dexter's Lab and the original Powerpuff Girls, they managed to appeal to kids and adults. They had unique visuals, memorable characters, and humor that worked on different levels.
So it wasn't just silly slapstick. There was some wit and sophistication in the writing that made it enjoyable for a wider audience.
Exactly. And that's something that's become tougher to pull off in today's world of children's animation. You have all these different audiences, shorter attention spans, and that pressure to create content that's easily marketable.
All right, let's wrap up this look at specific shows with Uncle Grandpa. And even I have trouble explaining that one sometimes. The critique seems to be truly offended by it, calling it garbage, and even suggesting it's harmful to kids.
Yeah, this is where their perspective really clashes with ideas of good taste and what's considered appropriate for kids. Uncle Grandpa is definitely an oddball, even for modern animation. It's known for its surreal humor, strange characters, and an animation style that can be kind of grotesque.
It's like they took all the rules of animation and tossed them out. And honestly, sometimes it works in a weird, absurdist way.
Yeah.
But I totally get why some people wouldn't like it, especially those expecting something more traditional.
Right. Uncle Grandpa is all about embracing the nonsensical, the strange, the downright bizarre. It deliberately messes with our expectations of what a cartoon should be. And that can either be exciting or really off-putting depending on who's watching.
So their reaction to Uncle Grandpa isn't really about the technical aspects of animation. It's more about a fundamental disagreement about what's in good taste or what's okay for kids.
That's it. And it brings up this question. Who gets to decide what's good or appropriate for kids to watch? Is it parents, educators, networks, or ultimately the kids themselves?
That's a tough one. And I think it reflects this larger conversation we're having about animation and its influence on young minds.
Definitely. And even though they use some strong language, I think this critique contributes to that conversation. It makes us think about the power of animation, how it can entertain and disturb, and the responsibility we have as viewers and creators to really think critically about this medium.
Okay, so we've gone through some specific examples from the critique. We've talked about how animation styles have changed, the shift toward meta-humor, the influence of different cultures, and even what's considered appropriate for children.
It's been a fascinating journey so far, but there's still more to unpack, especially their suggestion that Cartoon Network should just re-air those older shows they love. What does that say about the role of nostalgia in how we see animation? And how do we balance their personal preferences with the reality that this industry is always changing to meet the demands of a new audience and a competitive market?
Those are some great questions, and I can't wait to dig into them. But I think we should save that for the next part of our...
Sounds like a plan. We've set the stage. Now it's time to explore those broader implications and see if we can unearth some deeper meaning from this thought-provoking critique.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on how animation styles have changed and how stories are told. We even touched on that tricky question of what's considered appropriate for kids to watch.
Yeah, we've been all over the map, and I think we're getting a better sense of what this critique is all about.
Absolutely. But there's one thing from the critique we haven't really talked about yet. They suggest that Cartoon Network should just bring back those older shows they love.
That's interesting, isn't it? And I think it really speaks to how powerful nostalgia is when it comes to animation. We tend to link the cartoons we watched as kids with comfort and familiarity, that longing for simpler time.
Right, so when they say they want to see those older shows back on TV, it's not just about the shows themselves, it's about how those shows make them feel those memories they bring back.
Exactly. It's like wanting to go back to your childhood home. Even though it probably won't live up to your memories, you still crave that connection to the past.
And that makes me wonder, is it even possible to separate how we personally feel about certain shows from understanding how animation has actually evolved? Can we appreciate what's new and creative in today's cartoons while still recognizing the impact those older shows had on us?
That's the real challenge, isn't it? Balancing those sentimental feelings with a more objective view of how animation is adapting to a world that's constantly changing, a changing audience, a whole media landscape that's different now.
It's like saying we should only listen to music from a certain decade or only read books published before a certain year. It ignores the fact that art forms are always changing. They experiment. They push boundaries.
And yeah, sometimes those experiments don't work out. Sometimes we end up with stuff we just don't like. And that's okay. The great thing about art is that it's open to interpretation. What one person thinks is amazing might bore someone else to tears.
So how do we reconcile what the critique wants that return to the good old days with the reality that the animation industry has moved on? They're responding to new creative ideas, new technologies, and new pressures from the market.
I think this is where we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The critique, even though it's very personal and emotional, is just one perspective among many.
So what might feel like a drop in quality to one person could be seen as progress or innovation by someone else.
Exactly. And a network like Cartoon Network, their job isn't to please just one person who misses the old days. They have to offer a variety of shows that appeal to all sorts of viewers.
So yeah, it makes sense that they long for those older shows. But we have to remember their preferences might not reflect what today's kids like or want to watch.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that brings us back to a question we touched on earlier. What's the point of children's animation in today's world? Is it just about entertainment, or does it have a deeper purpose? To teach, to inspire, to even challenge kids?
Now, that's a big question, and I think the answer is probably different for everyone. For the viewers, the people making the shows, and for each individual show.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all recipe for making great animation.
Right.
But I think this critique reminds us of how deeply we connect with animation as an art form.
It shows us that even though people might brush it off as just kids' stuff, animation can really shape our imaginations, our sense of humor, even our values.
And that power comes with responsibility for both the people making cartoons and the people watching them to really engage with animation in a thoughtful and critical way, recognizing how much it can influence us.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of animation, what's your final takeaway for our listeners?
I'd say keep exploring this incredible world of animation. Don't be afraid to question your own ideas, to try new things, and to discover new styles, new stories, new ways of seeing the world through this amazingly versatile art form.
What a great thought. And remember, animation is forever, no matter how old you are or where you come from. So embrace the joy, the wonder, even those moments that make you cringe. It's all part of your...
And who knows, maybe you'll even feel inspired to create your own animated masterpiece.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. I hope you'll join us again next time as we continue to explore the ever-changing landscape of art, entertainment, and culture.